Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Daniel Campo, and I'm a professor of city planning, and I work in the School of Architecture and Planning at Morgan State University in Baltimore. And I'm here in Kiev at the invitation of MIT and Saga Development and Urban Curators, and we're here looking at post-industrial space. And this is a subject that I study in the United States, and I'm here to share my projects with you. Can I have the book? Yeah. So part of what I'm talking about today comes from my book, The Accidental Playground, and I brought a copy here to give to my hosts, Andre and Nastia. If you can come up here and get the book. It's for you. There's a dedication in there. Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it. Okay. Okay, let's see how this works. Right. Where should I stand? I guess I'll stand here. I'm fighting a bit of a cold today, so please be patient. My research starts in Brooklyn, but before that I should tell you that all the things that I look at are what I call the undesigned and unplanned. They're things that happen in cities that have very little to do with professional architecture, planning, and urban development. There's been a large discourse in architecture and planning and development about these subjects that's grown over the last 10 years. And these are some of the descriptors that are used to describe this kind of urbanism. I use the undesigned and unplanned as a kind of blanket term for these kinds of activities. I'm going to talk about the American Rustbelt, but before I do that, I'll start in Brooklyn. And part of this presentation that I'm making to you today is kind of a personal narrative. I used to work for New York City, and we were studying this entire waterfront, which is just across from Manhattan, for rezoning. So low value industrial property, rezone it to create space for mixed use and residential. And I was looking at this space later as a doctoral student, and I noticed a lot of things in a different light. I noticed that there was no park, nothing going on in terms of design, nothing to keep you safe, but yet people were out there every day. And people seemed to be drawn to this waterfront that was broken up, decaying, falling into the river. Is there a, right? Oh, maybe this, oh, there isn't a pointer, okay. This is a pier that used to have railroad cars run it and pulling cars off of barges full of goods. And the water quality is improving, and the wood that supports the pier is collapsing into the river. Meanwhile, New York City is trying to plan for this area, but failing. And all of their plans are very controversial. So while people are arguing about this, there are people there using the space. And I didn't know what I was looking at. And people said, well, what are you doing? What are you looking at? And I said, I'm looking at the place where people make their own environment. Later on, I would say it's a place of appropriation. And when I finished the book, this new term, autonomous spaces, seemed to be taking up some space. And another term I used was other. This was the other waterfront. This wasn't Brooklyn Bridge Park. This wasn't Hudson River Park. It wasn't a fancy park found in the Netherlands. This is a park that had zero investment, but yet it attracted things that you couldn't do in these organized spaces. And people loved this space. They came out there every day to sun themselves, to fish, to walk their dogs, to practice music, to touch the water. At this time, at the beginning of the 21st century, there were a few places in all of these new waterfront parks. It wasn't Brooklyn Bridge Park yet, if you guys are familiar with New York, but where you could actually touch the water, skip rocks on the water, have your dogs fetch a stick on the water. So people came to this place that had $0 investment to do that because they couldn't do it anywhere else. People also, in addition to the water, they came to have that experience of all of the elements of nature, the things that are often lacking in New York City: the open sky, the wind on a cold day, the sun, the earth. They could play with the earth here. They could touch it. They could move stuff around. There were no rules. And many people did it, and many people came for other reasons. They came to kind of escape. Right? The city is full of distractions, full of problems, full of noise. And people came here to kind of release themselves, to be away from it all, to get in touch with their feelings, to figure out stuff. And they came to construct, to build, the things you can't do in Central Park, the things you can't do in most parks in the United States. They built the skateboard park, and to practice music. This band practiced every Sunday for years. And they practiced so much that people would come and listen to them practice. So it was like a free concert. And because people heard the music from the street, but they couldn't see it, they got curious. And they said, oh, where's that music coming from? I need to find it. And that made this rough and dangerous site more safe, more inviting, more vital. And we don't have time because I want to move into the Rust Belt, but there were dozens, if not hundreds, of art pieces that were placed here. This was a very kind of creative area of the city, and artists in New York City are constrained by space, right? There's not a lot of extra space. So they would come to this waterfront and do their installations, their performances, photography, found object art, moving stuff around that they found on this broken up site. People would practice for Burning Man on this site, and so on. Well, perhaps part of its charm and its vitality was drawn from the fact that it wasn't going to be around for that much longer. Nobody knew when that day would come, but eventually it did. Very complicated politics, and I won't get into all of them, but New York State eventually purchased a 6-acre portion of the property, and after much cajoling, much convincing, they decided to kind of leave it as is. They asked me, I told them that, but then they ignored what I said about the rest of it. But you couldn't do all that fun stuff. You couldn't do the fire and the skateboarding. It was all not permitted. The other important piece is that the whole neighborhood is changing. A new mayoral administration rezoned 180 city blocks for high-density development. And you see in the right corner the first of many towers that will be built in the waterfront. So the people of this area that have been denied a waterfront park for so long, they won a small victory with this little piece of park that used to be 20 acres, then it became 7 acres, and then they had to absorb this rezoning. So it was kind of a bittersweet. All of this happened around the same time. And eventually more towers went up, right? And where this hipster flea market is taking place, there's another tower now. There's several. So let me just quickly, 2000, the year 2000, (2012), taken from the exact same space. So those working class Polish immigrants, some Irish, some Italian, some Puerto Rican, working class. Many were Vietnam veterans that were hanging out there when there was an active garbage dump on part of the site, were displaced for the flea market. Now the flea market is displaced for another tower. I couldn't take this picture today. So I was left with a dilemma. I'd been studying this professionally and academically for 15 years, and I needed to go somewhere else. And at the same time, one of my colleagues, Brent Ryan, who's presenting his research tomorrow about urban design, called me and he said, Dan, you've got to come to Detroit. He was doing his research on Detroit, and you're going to like it here. And on my very first trip in 2003, I was taken right away to the Packard automobile factory. And it's a different kind of a place than Brooklyn. It's not populated, right? But there was something so poetic about this place. It compelled me to explore, to think about it, to contemplate and visit again and again and again. And I have for the past 15 years. And I began to get interested in these cities, because these cities, and I'm a New York City resident, so I am genuinely excited about these places, but I have a balanced perspective, because these cities of the Rust Belt are difficult places. They're places that have lost over 50% of their population since 1950. Detroit was once one of the greatest and largest cities in the world, and today it's lost about 65% of its population since its peak in 1950. For those of you who are not familiar with the geography of the United States, this is Detroit. I'll be talking about that. Buffalo and Pittsburgh. All three of these cities have lost over 50% of their population. A very challenging place to do urban development of any kind. And I was particularly interested in these old buildings. How can we keep them? People like them. People do stuff in them. They encourage people's imagination. They are the subject of art. And I began to think about how do you preserve, how do you reuse old buildings in the American Rust Belt? And I decided to first look at some of the success stories in the Rust Belt, including, excuse me, including famous buildings like this one by Louis Sullivan, and this one by Frank Lloyd Wright, and this one by H.H. Richardson, right? These guys represent the kind of holy trinity of American architecture and are world famous, and many of you in the room know Richardson, know Frank Lloyd Wright, and also know the Olmsted firm, Frederick Law Olmsted, that did the grounds to this New York State psychiatric hospital. All of these became, in the last 15 years, celebrated restoration projects. But all of them took a boatload of money. This single-family home took $25 million of public money and $25 million of state money. $50 million. This building has enjoyed $20 or $30 million worth of public funds during two restorations. This building got a $75 million grant from New York State. So you can imagine, with these kinds of showpiece projects, there wasn't a lot of money to do other things. I also thought I'd take a look at what the standards were for industrial preservation, not just in New York, not just in the United States, not just in the Rust Belt, but across the world. And I happened upon the shining star of the post-industrial complex, the Duisburg Nord Park, Adriana Huhuza and Westgate did in the Ruhr Valley in Germany. Part of the Emscher project. The Emscher project cost over 4 billion euros, and about 2/3 of those euros came from public sources. So this is exquisite. Anyone who's visited, and maybe some of you have, it's stunning, it's beautiful, and it has a kind of pride in public space and in these kinds of facilities that's been lacking in many places in the United States. This kind of a park is not really feasible in the United States. And of course, this is a complicated project just down from where I showed you on the Brooklyn waterfront by about 3/4 of a mile. This is the Domino sugar refinery, and it's an 1880 sugar factory that's been preserved, but as you can see, Beijing is rising around it. So there's an interesting James Corner Field Operations Park that just opened a few weeks ago right here. You've got the restored 1884 building, and you've got these towers. A lot of money, both public and private, and maybe this is not the kind of thing that we're really interested in. And there used to be 20 other buildings on this site, and they're all gone for towers. There are some of the old buildings. So that's what it'll look like in 10 years, and that's what it used to look like. So I wrestled with these questions. How do we preserve in post-industrial structures and complexes when there's no money, when there's no expertise, when there's no resources to do it? And then if we can do some sort of preservation or reclamation, can we do it in a way which these places keep their vital qualities, the same kinds of qualities that I found in both the Brooklyn waterfront and many people also found in Brooklyn, as well as in places like Detroit and Buffalo? And finally, can we reprogram these in a way that allows for robust public use? You can be sure that the building itself will not have robust public use. They're thinking about tech firms and so on. So I started looking at all these sites, and I have about a dozen case study sites, and I can't share them all with you today. And they're in various states of completion, some more, some less so. But I'm going to share with you just a couple of projects, 2 in Buffalo, 1 in Detroit, and 1 in Pittsburgh. Let's look at Buffalo first. It's an interesting little place. In some places, it looks a lot like Detroit, and for good reason, because it's lost a lot of population and a lot of jobs. It has a really cool industrial and now post-industrial river called the Buffalo River, which connects to Lake Erie, part of this great kind of crossroads that enabled Buffalo to grow in the 19th and 20th centuries. But a lot of these grain elevators are now not used for grain. Some of them are. And these are the grain elevators that Rayner Banham, if you know Rayner Banham, A Concrete Atlantis, this is what he wrote about and celebrated in the 1970s and 1980s while he was at Buffalo in a long-term residency at the University at Buffalo. And Banham's argument is that these particular elevators is in part what inspired European modernism. The modernists, Corbusier, Gropius, Mendelssohn, they all saw these elevators either in person or through the trading of photographs. And part of the language of European modernism, you'll see, comes from these kinds of monumental structures. Okay. You get the sense, right? This is the first grain elevator that was poured continuously with slip forms. So it was poured in one big pour with these slip forms. It went they kept pouring the concrete. And in 2 parts, 1902 and 1920 something. So that 1902 part is the very first of its kind in the world. Anyway, most of these structures have been out of commission for somewhere between 20 and 50 years. This man here with the cowboy hat, Rick Smith, owned a metal shop nearby, right next to these grain elevators. And he thought, I need those train tracks that go into my metal shop, but they go through these grain elevators. I'm going to buy these grain elevators. They weren't very much money, and I'll use the tracks. And guess what? I can store grain in them. I could store corn to make ethanol, right? So he thought, I'll make an ethanol facility and I'll store the grain there. And it made a lot of sense to him economically. People didn't like it. The market for ethanol collapsed in the mid-2000s, completely collapsed. And he was left with these elevators. And while his idea to do the ethanol was kind of brewing, he had a kind of a big sense of humor, and he had an appreciation for these structures. He was a third generation business owner of this rigidized metals. And he invited the University at Buffalo architecture faculty to what will become Silo City, to study them, to inventory them, to do historic preservation research on them. So when the market fell out and he couldn't do his plan, he had another idea. He said, people love these things. They just show up to see them. German tourists are showing up to Buffalo to see these grain elevators. And, the ethanol stuff wasn't fun. I want to have fun. And he, using the advice of these people and others, he came up with a new plan. But the plan was not fully formed. And he kind of just uses the site as is. There's festivals, environmental festivals, music festivals, beer festivals, art festivals, projected art video on the side of the grain elevators, modern dance outside and inside the elevators, musical performances and theatrical performances inside the silos, art shows, anything under the sun, architectural experiments. If you have a good idea and you live in metropolitan Buffalo or anywhere else, you can contact them and they'll say, okay, well, maybe we can do it. Do you know how to do it? Do you have insurance? We can do it, So it's very open, it's organic, it costs very little, and it makes lots of people happy, and it's very distinctive of Buffalo, right? You can just show up randomly. It's changing because this place is getting very popular. And if you could give him $100 or something and go have your wedding photos taken on the site, the drama of these grain elevators. There's also actually been several weddings, even though there's no running water on the site. And if you're lucky enough, you can go on a tour, and the tour is pretty awesome. I've gone with kind of informally with the architecture professors, and there's something here that people really want. And it's not to be safe. It is the opposite of that. And they want to be able to touch these places, which you cannot do in a Frank Lloyd Wright house. You cannot touch, you cannot wander, you cannot take a photograph. You have to pay and make a reservation. This is not the case here, and people appreciate it. Not to mention, you get this view of the largest concentration of concrete grain elevators ever built in the world. And Rick Smith has this kind of, I'll say, evolving vision. It's not fully formed. People come up to him and say, hey, can we do this? Guess what? I want to take a river cruise and dock it at Silo City. And Jim will say, all right, well, you build a dock for me, we can do it. And so a dock gets built, right? Now a second dock gets built, right? There's a space where there were some weddings held, but Rick Smith and Jim Watkins, who's the caretaker, thought, we're going to have a climbing gym inside, and we're going to have yoga, and we're going to have a community space. And this was their idea for 2 or 3 years, but it didn't work out. And this was like 14, and then by 16, he said, you know what, it wasn't going to work out, and the roofs are leaking on that grain elevator, and water's coming in, and I don't have the money to fix it, and it's okay. Young people today know that they appreciate that these places are imperfect. So he set his sights on this little office building that was part of the complex. And he said, you know what? We've already had architectural competitions in this building. Why don't we renovate it? And we can have a little place for poetry, for music, for the World Cup. Anyway, it took him 2.5 years, because he couldn't get a sewer permit. This is typical in the United States. This does happen. You know, there was no reason why they shouldn't give him a sewer permit, but somehow they didn't. And while that was happening, all those delays, that allowed him to reimagine it yet again and said, you know what, maybe we can do the garage in the back. And so they did the garage, which you see in the foreground, the front foreground, the people, the garage, then the office building, and then the grain elevators. So when it opened just this year, you've got a nice space. All the materials for the bar and the lights and all the fixtures come from the grain elevators. So they harvested that material. This is a very big United States preservation no-no. You don't take stuff from a historic building. He took it, and it was all DIY, sweat equity, friends of his, and so on. And they built the bar, they built everything in this room. It's very wonderful. People are watching the World Cup. This is just last month. And then others are hanging out, playing soccer. Of course, this fits into a much larger vision of the restored Buffalo River, what Rayner Banham called Elevator Alley, the alley with all the elevators that Buffalonians had always enjoyed. And indeed, I got to go on a kayak trip last month. It's a wonderful thing, and the uses of this place will continue to evolve over time. All of this was very unexpected. Case study number 2. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Pittsburgh is synonymous with steel. More steel was manufactured in the Pittsburgh area in the 20th century than anywhere else in the world. A lot of that steel went into World War II armaments during the 40s. I'm going to have to come over here. This is where U.S. Steel, if you know who Andrew Carnegie is, this was his largest factory, most important factory through much of the 20th century. This is made steel here. Carnegie made iron here, called the Kerry blast furnaces. The hot iron was made here, put onto rail cars, molten, and then made into steel here. This is not a little dinky factory. This is one of the most important factories in the history of the United States. Today, the steel factory is this. And there are token gestures and little tiny bits that have been saved. But basically, this is what it is. However, the iron factory, this was the steel, 400 acres, iron just under 200, also demolished. But somehow, a little part of it didn't get demolished. They ran out of money, they were waiting for something, and it stood there. This was all filled with buildings and railroad tracks up until the late 1970s. 2 buildings remain. And they were in kind of a forest, a post-industrial forest, kind of like what you have here along the river in Podil, right? There's places where it's all overgrown. And you had to hike in to get to this site. It's called the Kerry blast furnaces. In the United States, they named blast furnaces where they made iron after women. And while the plans are being made to demolish the last 2 blast furnaces, artists are hiking into the site, breaking into it, and building stuff. And they're photographing owls and deer and other wildlife and spending their free time there. Kids are getting in there. You know, they're hanging out, they're teenagers, they're doing what teenagers do. And the site is being used. You'd never know it by visiting, even in the middle of the day, because it was so intermittent. 2 of those are artists. The other guy is I won't tell you about him, but he's important. They made this giant owl And the owl was the wingspan of the owl, all of recycled materials they found on a site that was going to be demolished. It was about 120 feet wide, and they hung it from a building. The owners of the site that were going to make it into something else found out, it's a long story, I'll tell you that anecdote another time, and it was demolished. The artist said, you know what, we're going to do something better. So every Sunday they broke onto the site, they took their hand tools, hiked in because there was no road access, and they built the Kerry deer. This is 40 feet. From here to the top is 40 feet. So it's a sizable installation, all made of metal and rubber and other parts that they found on the site. Well, the Kerry deer is a kind of interesting thing because this illegal, unforeseen, transgressive act that the artists had no intent, they thought they would do it and they'd take some pictures of it and it would last for a few months, if best, and then it would be gone. But somehow it lasted because people found out about it. You've got to see this deer. You got to see this deer. And the architectural historians that were looking at this site to try and save it, they knew about it too. And then there was a tour of the site with the owners, and they were afraid the owners were going to see it. And they were like, you can't look over there. But they needed permits to take photographs. And anyway, when the representatives of the owners of the site saw it, they said, hey, this is really cool. I can't believe this. Somebody did this, right? They were actually excited about it. And so this deer helped save these blast furnaces. So, okay, so you have this site. What are you going to do with it, right? Well, it's a complicated, the Silo City is owned by a private entity, by a person. This is owned by underneath it, it's owned by the county that, metal. It's a complicated ownership structure, and it's run by a not-for-profit in association with the U.S. National Park Service. And people come to this site for all kinds of reasons, and they don't have a master plan. It's evolving, and maybe they will soon, actually. They're trying to conserve the blast furnaces. They're trying to program the site. They're trying to do things to expose people to the history of steel in the Pittsburgh area. So you can get a tour, but you can also, there's all kinds of interesting things that happens here. American Gladiator, wanted to film there, right? There's just like Silo City, there's a range of events, art events, metal pours, stuff that gets people excited about Pittsburgh that's unique to the Pittsburgh region, right? Sausages. There's a very large Polish community and also a sizable Ukrainian community in Pittsburgh, not as big as the Polish, but so there's the American Gladiator, a series of music festivals. The Bach Choir of Pittsburgh performed in the room that had the owl once, right? So some of it is highbrow, some of it is lowbrow. There's graffiti workshops. So some of it is related to industrial history, some of it is related to contemporary street art. But the two areas and the two constituencies grow together. So those who come for the street art get exposed to the industrial history, and those who come to the industrial history get exposed to the street art. And now you have a bigger group constituency that supports this kind of activity. Two more quick examples. Buffalo Central Terminal, this is the most endangered of all the case studies that I'm going to show you because it's so big, and the people who run it are just neighborhood people who have been fighting for it for over 20 years. And they wrestled from it through traditional activism from 3 terrible owners. Eventually, in 1996, they got title for it. But they had no money and no political support, very little. And today, it's a kind of work in progress. And they have stuff in these buildings. It's 15 acres, 500,000 square feet inside, and they have events, and they do things in it, right? You can go, You can show up on a Saturday, throw a few bucks in the can, and walk around. Nobody bothers you. You can take pictures. They have different events. They have stuff related to Polish heritage. This is the Polish area of Buffalo, right? And this is how I got introduced to the site. Brent Ryan, who got me interested in the Rust Belt, said, this is Dan, I'm in Buffalo. And I said, Brent, what are you doing in Buffalo? He said, it's like Detroit. They have an abandoned train station here. I was like, oh, okay. But they're doing something about it, right? People have taken their energy and decided to solve the problem, right? And through activism, through various grassroots campaigns, fundraising, an alliance with a local city councilman, Dave Franzik, because on the left, Polish American, they began to fix it, but they had no money. So they kind of do this on weekends, right? It's done by volunteers with people who have volunteered with donated materials, and slowly but surely they're restoring the interior of the station. This is one of the great stations of the United States. And it's cool. You can be a part of it and volunteer. You can just show up and see it. And it's evolving, right? It's not all done at once, and it's all local. And it's a long-term project, right? So this is a fairly recent picture, it's like this year or last year, right? But the tower, do you see the tower? This is what some of the floors of the tower look like. So they're not trying to do it all at once. They can't. It's impossible. And it's a train station, but train traffic is actually, people want to bring it back, but it's complicated, and if it happens, it may be 15 or 20 years from now. But right now, let's use the building. Let's have some fun. Let's have a big celebration. This is the famous Polish Easter celebration that they have every spring, right? People want to be in this building. They're running into some issues right now as they're trying to develop it more conventionally and get investors to come in and have office space. They're running into a lot of issues, and there's this was a board meeting, and it's a story that hasn't finished yet. And it may not have a happy ending, it might, but right now it's kind of happy that you can go and enjoy this building. Lastly, that other train station, one of the two great ruins of Detroit, right? The Packard Automobile Factory and the Michigan Central Station, west side of Detroit. It was once booming, and now there's a smaller but boom happening there. Smaller, but it's happening, right? Irish area, kind of a secondary commercial zone about a mile out of the downtown. And this is what it looked like. And people from all over the world came to this train station to take pictures of it, to explore it, to go to rave music festivals in it, all kinds of stuff to be inspired by it. But it was open, falling apart, and incomplete, no use. Many citizens that lived in the area were interested in saving this building, but it was owned by an asshole who didn't want to give title to it, didn't want to fix it up, didn't want to work with the city, didn't want to work with the neighborhood. Well, one guy, a guy who had owned this restaurant, opened this restaurant here called Slow's Barbecue, he decided that he was very slick. He made friends with, he was a former model. He made friends with the owner. He had little mini parties in there. Eventually, him and the owner have a falling out, and he's not invited back. But in the interim, he's putting together a plan to save the station. And he talks to a lot of people. He raises just a few $1,000s, and he realizes, though, that he's not going to be able to save the station. So he says, I'm going to save the park next to the station, right? So this is Michigan Avenue, the main drag of this area. And that's the station. So it's the park in between Michigan Avenue and the train station. This is a key parcel, a parcel that has been ignored by the city of Detroit for almost 50 years. So first thing he does is he gets volunteers from Chrysler. They have a volunteer day, other car makers, people from the area, and they fix up this pedestrian island so it's more safe for people crossing Michigan, this intersection of Michigan Avenue, and also to kind of create this comfortable viewing space of the station, right? Very far from the station, not the station, but this is what they could do. The following year, Chrysler comes to this guy, and Phil Cooley is his name, and says, we want to do it again. It was really fun last year. And so he said, we can do something more. Why don't we do a garden in front of the station? And in fact, I don't have a picture of him, but Phil Cooley had already contacted the architects at Urban Detail Architecture, a very small firm in Detroit. And this is one of the architects, Noah Resnick. And he wasn't a landscape architect, but he helped design this, what they call the meditation garden. And you can see here the volunteers. This is from the top of the station doing this meditation garden. All the while, the owner has these security people around the edge of the station harassing you if you try to walk too close to the station. So this is what they could do. It wasn't much. All the materials are recycled, all the labor is volunteered, and so on. Third year, let's make a little, and again, Phil Cooley is acting in his own interest. These are all things that will help him with his businesses on Michigan Avenue, but that's okay. Third year, they build a little parking lot, seemingly very insignificant, right? But it doubles as an event space. It has this rainwater catchment area, state of the art, gets more people excited about the station. And this is how the master plan that Urban Detail put together actually works. It's a whole bunch of different mix and match ideas that can be incorporated slowly, incrementally, over time as opportunities present themselves, right? And the park today this is what it looks like. This was last September. Nobody uses it except for the most part. There's some homeless guys that camp out over there. There's students that go around and do art projects. It's not like heavily used, but the constituency for this building is growing. In fact, the whole neighborhood is growing. It's becoming this area noted for do-it-yourself, for art, for street art, for startup tech, so much so that the Ford Motor Company actually purchased this building from that terrible landowner, right? So now Ford owns that building and is looking to figure out what to do with that building that will serve their own needs, perhaps be a hub for their automated vehicle and for their all the other transportation initiatives they're working on, while connecting to the energy of the neighborhood, right? So if you don't have this stuff happening, you don't have the growth of this neighborhood, Corktown, west side of Detroit, you may never get Ford. And in fact, the city of Detroit tried to demolish this building several times, but did not have the money, right? Council people, city council people, were calling for the demolition of this building. Other plans called turning it into a casino and turning it into a police headquarters, barricaded, you've seen that. So these kinds of tactical actions can have results. This story is also not over. We'll see what Ford does with this. I think you're getting the idea. We don't have to go through this. This is a laundry list of things, of findings from my years of visiting these sites. None of these stories are over. And in 5 years, there'll be something new to report. But people are using these areas today. And it didn't take a lot of investment. It didn't take big partnerships. It didn't take a whole bunch of professionals. And in fact, if we had a whole bunch of professionals, we would have not gotten Roosevelt Park, we would have not gotten the Central Terminal, and we definitely wouldn't have gotten Silo City, right? And it's imperfect, it's slow, it's incremental. It's not something that solves every issue. Sometimes things fail. This is the station in the background, the central station in Central Terminal in Buffalo. They're having all kinds of problems. They've had roof leaks, they've had this, they've had that. One massive, massive storm, they have it fixed now, could have destroyed the roof, and then the political momentum would have changed to knocking this down, right? So there's got to be even a little element of luck, of accident involved, right? And I would argue that the fancy stuff that I showed you at the beginning that's being built in Brooklyn, in New York City, is not actually incompatible with any of this transgressive, do-it-yourself, illegal activity. In fact, they're very related. Today, you have the transgressive activity. Tomorrow, you have events. The day after, you have not-for-profits doing programming. You have a not-for-profit corporation forming around these sites, and then 20 years from now, you have a high-tech hub, you have national corporations, and so on. So there's a dialogue between all of these states. I call it an arc of formality. These places are going to get more formal over time. But all of these stages are important, and we can use a building that's completely abandoned tomorrow. We can do something in it, right? And this is, I think, the last slide. We don't have time to go through all of this, but I think there are a lot, and I don't know how many of you are architects, are involved in urban development, and are involved in city planning. I know many of you are interested because you're here, and I know many of you are interested in the future of industrial buildings in Padil, right? And that's kind of what we hope some of our research in the United States may gently inform, right? It's highly localized, and I don't purport to say, well, they did it in Buffalo, you can do it here. It's much more complicated than that. But I think there are some general ideas, some lessons that all of us who care about post-industrial buildings and post-industrial complexes and post-industrial landscapes can learn, right? The first is that we can't wait. You can't wait for the investors. You can't wait for the big deal. You've got to do it. And anyone in this room can be a catalyst of change. And that's what's happened at all these places in the Rust Belt in the United States, these ones I've showed you. You can't wait for the best conditions. Accidents are good. Imperfection is good. If it was perfect, all the money would already be flowing to it, and you wouldn't have your opportunity to build a clubhouse or to put your art there or to move the dirt around, right? All of these different things that you might do allow a constituency to grow, right? Allow more things to become possible without a master plan. And many people will be involved. You personally can't be the only one, you and your friends. You have to invite others to come and do stuff. There's a project similar to this in Baltimore now, and that's where I teach, but it's failing because one guy insists upon doing everything, and he's not allowing other people to kind of come and do their thing, and, oh, we want to do glass blowing, or whatever it is. I have to get the insurance, I have to do this. You allow those other people to do that. They're the experts at it. You're not. You just do your due diligence. And then there's some bigger picture kind of philosophical issues that I think are also important for anyone thinking about both professionally in the world of development and architecture, but also as citizens that we need to think about. First of all, we need to think about all of these post-industrial complexes as places rather than buildings, rather than just objects like a Frank Lloyd Wright house that you want to preserve. They're places. Places are imperfect, they grow, they shrink, they change, they're adopted by different people, and we need to use urbanism, we need to think of these as urban places first, and buildings for preservation second. I don't know if this is true here, but in the United States, in historic preservation, everybody wants to preserve the past just as it was in 1920 or 1895 or 1932. And then they say, by preserving the past, we will have a great future. It will create jobs. People will want to move back to Buffalo, right? But somehow, between the past and the future, we've forgotten about the present. I teach architecture students, and when I teach them, planning students too, I try to refocus them back to the present. What can we do tomorrow, next week, next month, 6 months from now? People in Buffalo and Detroit have been waiting for years and years and years and years for projects to actually get built. They rarely do, and when they do, they disappoint, right? The present is vital, and we should try to do stuff that maximizes the present. And finally, I'll skip the second to last one. I think, and this is really true of the United States, and I don't know, I think I think being here in Kiev, I think there's a higher tolerance for risk. So maybe this doesn't apply, but in the United States, we're very bound by codes, by laws about safety, and it's good. It's a very good thing. But sometimes it makes us cautious. We're afraid to do things. We're afraid to get out and explore, physically and kind of with conceptually, right? And sometimes you have to make what we say a leap of faith. You have to have confidence that whatever you're doing is going to be successful, it's going to be vital, that people are going to want to be a part of it. Because if you don't have that confidence, it's not going to happen. And sometimes you have to say, you know what? I'm going to do this, and most likely it's going to work out. And if it doesn't, nobody's going to get hurt, right? And this is what we try in the United States, what we have to work on here. I sense there's a great creative spirit here in Kiev, and there's a great kind of, and I know the work of urban curators is part of this, a willingness to kind of push the boundaries a little bit. And that's very admirable. And I hope maybe when we leave in a few days that maybe we can take some of that spirit, and the MIT students that we brought along with us here will also feel that excitement to do something and not wait until all the stars are aligned, like everything is perfect. We've got to take some chances in urban development, and these are exactly the places to do it. I want to thank you. This was fun. If you have any, we'll have a conversation, but if you have any comments at all, you can email me, daniel.campo@morgan.edu. You can also find me on Twitter, BK Waterfront, about the Brooklyn waterfront, if you have the book. That's the Brooklyn waterfront. And also on Instagram. And I'd love to have a dialogue with you. And I thank you so much for having me here this evening. I really appreciate it. Thank you.